Today we're going over some of the most evil human experiments in history, and when I say evil, I don't mean someone putting pineapple on pizza. I'm talking about experiments where scientists, doctors, governments, and military officials looked at human beings and somehow thought, yes, this is acceptable research. Number 1, Unit 731. We're starting with one of the darkest examples of human experimentation ever documented, Unit 731. A secret Japanese military research facility operating during World War II. Officially, it was involved in researching infectious diseases and biological warfare, which already sounds like a job description written by someone who should absolutely not be allowed near a laboratory. The facility was based in occupied Manchuria, and it was led by surgeon and army officer Shiro Ishii. Behind the walls, prisoners were subjected to horrific experiments designed to study diseases, injuries, extreme temperatures, and the effects of biological weapons. The victims included Chinese civilians, prisoners of war, and other people considered enemies or disposable by the Japanese military. One particularly horrifying area of research involved freezing experiments. People were deliberately exposed to extreme cold, so researchers could study frostbite and hypothermia. Instead of treating victims like patients, the researchers treated them like equipment. If a machine broke, you fixed it. If a human being suffered, apparently you wrote down the temperature. Researchers also infected prisoners with diseases such as plague, cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. The purpose was not to understand disease in order to save lives. The purpose was largely to understand how diseases could be weaponized. And this is where the whole thing goes from horrifying to completely insane. Some prisoners were also subjected to vivisection, meaning operations performed on living people without proper anesthesia. The victims were sometimes deliberately infected first, allowing researchers to observe how disease affected the body. There were also experiments involving pressure, starvation, dehydration, and other extreme conditions. The exact number of victims remains uncertain, but historians agree that thousands died in experiments and related activities. And the story gets even worse because after the war, some people associated with Unit 731 avoided prosecution in exchange for information about their research. So imagine committing horrific crimes, then showing up with your notes like, "Good news, I brought the spreadsheet."
Wait.
History unfortunately contains many moments where scientific knowledge was valued more highly than human life. Unit 731 is one of the clearest examples of what happens when medicine loses its most basic rule: the patient is a person. Number 2, Nazi medical experiments. If Unit 731 was a nightmare laboratory, the concentration camp experiments conducted under Nazi Germany were another horrifying chapter. During the Holocaust, Nazi doctors performed experiments on prisoners in concentration and extermination camps. The victims were mostly Jewish prisoners, but also Roma people, prisoners of war, disabled people, and others targeted by the regime. The experiments included studies of hypothermia, high-altitude infectious disease, injuries, sterilization, and attempts to develop treatments for battlefield wounds. One of the most infamous doctors was Joseph Mengele, who worked at Auschwitz. Mengele became notorious for experiments involving twins, especially children. He collected measurements, compared physical characteristics, and performed procedures that had no legitimate medical purpose. The idea was to learn more about heredity and genetics. But the methods were cruel and scientifically corrupted by Nazi racial ideology. Another series of experiments involved exposing prisoners to extremely cold conditions. German military researchers wanted to understand how pilots or sailors might survive cold water. So prisoners were placed in freezing conditions while researchers measured their reactions. Again, the question was not, how do we keep people safe? It was more like, how much suffering can we record before the human body gives up? Other prisoners were subjected to experiments involving pressure chambers. The goal was to study what might happen to pilots at high altitude. Some experiments were fatal. There were also deliberate infection experiments, where prisoners were exposed to diseases so researchers could observe symptoms or test treatments. Sterilization experiments were conducted on prisoners as part of the Nazi obsession with racial purification. These procedures were performed without meaningful consent and often caused permanent injuries or death. What makes these experiments especially disturbing is that many perpetrators were trained physicians. These were not people who accidentally wandered into a laboratory. They had medical education, professional titles, and institutional authority. They simply decided that the people in front of them did not deserve the same ethical protections as everyone else. After the war, the doctor's trial at Nuremberg helped establish important principles for ethical research. The resulting Nuremberg Code emphasized voluntary consent and made clear that people should not be treated as experimental material without their agreement. It is one of the most important legacies to emerge from an otherwise horrific period. The lesson was painfully simple. Being a doctor does not automatically make someone a good person. You can have a medical degree and still make decisions that belong in the darkest chapter of human history. Number 3, the Tuskegee syphilis study. Now we move to the United States, where one of the most infamous unethical medical studies lasted for decades. The Tuskegee syphilis study began in 1932 in Alabama. The study involved hundreds of black men, many of them poor sharecroppers. Researchers wanted to observe the natural progression of untreated syphilis. There was one enormous problem. The men were not properly informed about what was happening. Participants were told they were receiving treatment for bad blood, a vague local term that could refer to several illnesses. In reality, researchers were studying their disease. And then came the part that makes this story especially disturbing. Even after penicillin became an effective treatment for syphilis in the 1940s, researchers did not provide it to participants as a treatment for the disease. The study continued for decades. Some men died from complications associated with syphilis. Some infected their partners, and some children were born with congenital syphilis. The study finally ended in 1972 after public exposure and outrage. By then, the damage had been enormous. A government advisory panel concluded that the study was ethically unjustified. Lawsuits followed, and the United States government eventually reached a settlement with surviving participants and their families. The study became a major example of racism, exploitation, deception, and the absence of informed consent in medical research. There is also an important point here. The men were not foolish for participating. They were approached by people representing institutions that were supposed to help them. When a government doctor tells you something is medical care, you have a reasonable reason to believe them. That trust was abused. The study contributed to a long-lasting distrust of medical institutions among many Black Americans. And honestly, once a doctor lies to you for 40 years, convincing you to trust the healthcare system again is going to be a difficult sales pitch. Number 4, the Guatemala syphilis experiments. If you thought Tuskegee was as bad as it gets, history unfortunately had another chapter waiting. Between 1946 and 1948, researchers associated with the United States government conducted experiments in Guatemala involving sexually transmitted infections. The researchers wanted to study whether penicillin could prevent or treat infections such as syphilis and gonorrhea. Instead of simply observing people who already had infections, researchers deliberately exposed people to sexually transmitted diseases. The victims included prisoners, soldiers, sex workers, and psychiatric patients. Many participants did not provide informed consent. Some were deliberately exposed through sexual contact. Others were exposed using infectious material. The experiments were not properly disclosed to the people involved. And for decades, the public knew little about what had happened. The research became widely known only after historian Susan Reverby uncovered records in the early 21st century. In 2010, the United States government formally acknowledged the experiments and apologized to Guatemala. The incident caused international outrage. It also demonstrated something important about ethics. A scientific question does not become acceptable simply because the answer might be useful. You cannot say, "We really wanted to know whether this disease spreads," and then use people who never agreed to participate as unwilling test subjects. That is not research ethics. That is basically science with the morality settings turned off. Number 5, the Stanford prison experiment. Now we move away from deliberate infection and military medicine and into psychology. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo conducted the Stanford prison experiment. The study placed college students into a simulated prison environment. Some were assigned to be prisoners, while others were assigned to be guards. The experiment was supposed to examine how people respond to positions of power and confinement. The situation escalated rapidly. Some guards became increasingly harsh, while prisoners experienced significant emotional distress. The experiment was planned to last 2 weeks, but was stopped after only 6 days. For decades, the study became famous as evidence that ordinary people could quickly become abusive when given authority. It appeared in textbooks, documentaries, lectures, and countless discussions about human behavior. However, later research has challenged the traditional interpretation of the experiment. Researchers have argued that participants were influenced by instructions from the experimenters and that the behavior was more complicated than the famous story suggested. Some participants reportedly resisted the role they had been assigned, while others became deeply involved in it. So the experiment remains controversial not only because of its ethics, but also because of what it actually demonstrated. Still, the study is remembered as an example of why researchers need strong ethical safeguards. If your experiment requires you to say, "Okay, everyone stop pretending to be prison guards because this is getting way too real," that is probably a sign the research meeting has gone slightly off the rails. Number 6, the monster study. In 1939, researchers conducted a speech experiment involving children at an orphanage in Iowa. The study later became known as the monster study. The researchers were interested in whether stuttering could be influenced by psychological treatment. Some children received positive speech feedback. Others were subjected to negative comments designed to make them anxious about their speech. The children were told things that could make them believe they had serious speech problems, even when they did not necessarily have them. The experiment was deeply unethical because the children could not meaningfully consent to the psychological manipulation. Some reportedly experienced lasting anxiety about speaking. The researchers were essentially testing whether criticism could damage confidence. And congratulations, they discovered something humanity had already known since approximately the invention of school. Telling a child that they are terrible at something can make them feel terrible about it. The study was kept out of public attention for many years. In 2001, the University of Iowa apologized for the research. The case is important because it shows that unethical experimentation is not limited to torture chambers or secret military laboratories. Harm can also happen through psychological manipulation, especially when researchers hold authority over vulnerable people. Number 7, the Little Albert experiment. Another famous psychology experiment involved a baby known as Little Albert. In 1920, psychologist John B. Watson and his assistant Rosalie Rayner studied whether fear could be conditioned in an infant. The child was introduced to a white rat. At first, the baby was not afraid of it. Then the researchers paired the rat with a loud, frightening noise. Eventually, the child began showing fear toward the rat. The researchers then observed whether the fear could spread to other similar objects. The experiment became famous as an early demonstration of classical conditioning in humans. But ethically, it is difficult to defend. The researchers deliberately created fear in an infant and did not provide a clear process for reversing the conditioning. There were also major questions about the child's identity, health, and what happened afterward. Later researchers have debated exactly what the experiment proved and how reliable its methods were. But the ethical problem remains obvious. If your experiment begins with a baby who is perfectly happy around a fluffy animal and ends with the baby being frightened by it, maybe the ethics committee should have entered the room a little earlier. Number 8, the obedience experiments. In the 1960s, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted experiments on obedience to authority. Participants were told they were taking part in a study about learning. They were instructed to administer increasingly powerful electric shocks to another person whenever that person answered a question incorrectly. The shocks were not actually real. The person receiving them was an actor. But the participants did not know that. As the experiment continued, the actor screamed, complained, and eventually stopped responding. The researcher calmly instructed the participant to continue. The shocking result was that many participants continued far beyond the point where they were comfortable. Milgram's work became one of the most famous studies in psychology. It suggested that ordinary people may obey authority figures, even when ordered to do something they believe is harmful. But the experiment also created serious ethical concerns. Participants experienced intense stress and believed they might be seriously hurting another person. Modern research ethics would require far greater protections. And that is probably for the best. Because if a scientist has to keep saying, "Please continue," the experiment requires you to continue. And the participant is sweating like they just discovered their tax audit, something has probably gone wrong. Number 9, the aversion experiments in apartheid South Africa. During apartheid in South Africa, military and medical institutions were involved in attempts to identify and alter the sexual orientation of gay soldiers. Some people were subjected to psychiatric treatment, drug administration, electric shock procedures, and other forms of coercive intervention. The underlying assumption was that homosexuality was an illness or defect that could and should be corrected. These practices caused psychological and physical harm. They also demonstrate how political ideology can corrupt medicine. Once a government decides that a particular group is unacceptable, medical institutions can be pressured into treating identity itself as a disease. Modern medicine rejects that idea. Sexual orientation is not a disorder that requires treatment. The history of these experiments is a warning about what happens when prejudice walks into a laboratory wearing a white coat. Number 10, the lessons we somehow had to learn the hard way. Looking across these cases, there is a disturbing pattern. The victims were people with less power, prisoners, children, poor communities, or patients. That is why research ethics emphasizes informed consent, minimizing harm, and the right to withdraw. The lesson is not that science is evil. Science has saved millions of lives. The lesson is that science without ethics can become dangerous. An experiment performed on someone who never agreed to participate is not a triumph of science. It is an abuse of power wearing a laboratory coat. And if history has taught us anything, the phrase, "Don't worry, this is for science," should never replace informed consent. Because the most important experiment is the one we decide not to perform. Humanity has suffered to prove that point. Past isn't dead. It's waiting to be told.